Pardon me while I eat my lunch.
You are just fine. I'm going to do a little presentation, so I'm going to mute you for now, and then we'll have conversation after that, if that sounds good. Great. All right. I'm already recording, and I don't have, here we go. Nope, that's not what I want to do. Present. Is it? Oh, there it goes. Okay. So welcome everybody to our Pprc, Pastor-Parish Relations Committee Town Hall. We have a good number of the members of our committee on this call, so we'll probably get them to chat a little more later. But we decided to do this just to help educate folks who may or may not have a background in Methodism about how our clergy and staffing situation works as a Methodist church, and just give an opportunity for folks to ask questions so they can better understand how all of that works. Because Methodists are a little odd in some of this. So a few things that are important to understand. So the United Methodist Church, which is the denomination that we're a part of at the moment, is connectional, which means that individual churches are not really individual churches. They're part of bigger structures. And the United Methodist Church is also Episcopal, which means that we have bishops. And so like Episcopalians and Catholics and Methodists have bishops. Baptists do not, but we are an Episcopal denomination. The UMC's governance structure includes General Conference, which we have been talking about a good bit. This is the theoretically every 4 years international gathering of clergy and lay representatives of the United Methodist Church, and it's the only body that is authorized to speak for the UMC. That's where legislative decisions are made. And then we have the Council of Bishops, which is a body of all bishops, even retired bishops sit on that. So we occasionally get, or I occasionally get, some fun reports from Ray Chamberlain, who is a retired bishop here in town, who's connected with Green Street. And then we have the Judicial Council. So these are kind of our branches of government in the UMC. And you don't necessarily need to know exactly what all of those things do, except for General Conference is pretty important, but wanted to outline those. So the UMC structurally is divided into jurisdictions, conferences, and districts. And those are little nesting dolls that districts are within, conferences are within jurisdictions. And so Green Street, we are part of the Southeastern jurisdiction. We are in the Western North Carolina Conference, and we are part of the Yadkin Valley District. So those are our affiliations down the line. And in case a map is helpful, so here are the United Methodist jurisdictions and conferences in the United States. And just to note, obviously the global perspective of the UMC is really important, especially to a lot of the conversations we're having right now around LGBTQ+ inclusion. But for the purposes of talking about clergy appointment, really a focus on the US structure is sufficient. So you can see that there are a number of conferences that are just by state. So Iowa is its own conference, and Tennessee is its own conference. But then there are some, so North Carolina actually has two conferences, confusingly called the North Carolina Conference and the Western North Carolina Conference. And then there are, Texas has several different conferences. And then there are some places that encompass a number of different states. So Rocky Mountain, you see, covers a couple different states. So then there's some other odd conferences. Well, I say odd in relation to statehood conferences here and there. Redbird Missionary Conference, Holston Conference, and there are a few that are related to some sort of Native American outreach and mission. So that is your sort of overview. So you can see us. We are over here in Western North Carolina. And then this is the Western North Carolina Conference and the districts. So a number of years ago, there were 16 districts, I think, and then we cut those in half. So we have many fewer districts than we used to have, which has been good in some ways and presented some challenges. But you see we've got Smoky Mountain, Blue Ridge, Appalachian, Catawba Valley, Metro Uwharrie, Northern Piedmont, and Yadkin Valley, which is where we are. But of course, we're not at all far from some of these other districts, but we operate within the Yadkin Valley District. Oops. To put some faces and names to people who are important to decision making. Our bishop is Reverend Paul Leland. He will be retiring later this year. So, and I think we've shared some that we are not sure yet whether any new bishops will be elected this year, which presents kind of an interesting conundrum of whether we'll come under the authority of a neighboring bishop or what might happen. But he was actually supposed to retire last year, and everything has been sort of delayed by the pandemic. And then our district superintendent is Reverend Dr. Sam Moore. So he is the DS for the Yadkin Valley District. And I believe that Sam has attended Green Street a number of times, so some of y'all may have seen or met him before. Again, this is all like very general, but if there are particular things that you have questions about, we'll get to that later. So UMC clergy can be ordained as elders or deacons. So once upon a time, if you were being ordained United Methodist, you would first be ordained a deacon, and then that was sort of the stepping stone to being ordained an elder, which is considered a full clergy person. Now we have two separate full connection, full ordination paths. Elders are kind of what you might think of if you pictured an ordained minister. They are ordained to mostly to work in a local church, to lead in the way that a senior pastor might. Whereas deacons can serve in a variety of different contexts. They're ordained to really to the community, to be kind of a bridge between the church and the community. Ortiz coming in. So, and I just mentioned that because I am an ordained elder at my old church. When I was at Centenary Methodist Church, we had a number of elders on staff, but we also had a deacon. Our children's minister was an ordained deacon. And so she was, deacons do not celebrate the sacraments. Some of them preach, some of them don't. It can kind of vary, but I put this picture here. I don't know these people. They looked very nice, but the folks with the straight down stoles that you see, like the kind that I would wear or that Maria might wear, that is an elder, the sign of an elder. And then we called it a Miss America sash with my colleague at my other church. The diagonal stole signifies a deacon. So if you ever see someone in a United Methodist church wearing the diagonal stole, that means that they're a deacon, that they have a little bit of a different call. And the appointment system most directly affects elders. So deacons, part of their deal is that they find their own jobs, whether it's in a church, whether it's outside of the church. Elders are appointed, and I kind of broke up all of these pieces of it. Elders are appointed annually by the bishop in consultation with the district superintendent and the congregation through the Pprc. So every year appointed by the bishop in consultation with the DS and the congregation. Oops. The congregation in this case is represented by the Pastor-Parish Relations Committee. This is who's on our Pastor-Parish Relations Committee at Green Street. Artisa, Mary, Jack, Amaris, Tara, Aquetta, Shelley, Kelly, Kate, and Chris is a great group of people, and they meet regularly. Especially this last year, they've been meeting a lot to deal with staff transitions. So, but I think it's helpful for the congregation to sort of know who's on this committee, so that if you ever have, a question or something you've been wondering about or concerned about, that you know who you can go to who might have a little more information besides just me. I mean, I'm always happy to answer your questions, but sometimes you want to go to somebody other than a pastor, and that's just fine. And to just give an overview of Green Street UMC clergy and staff. So I'm the senior pastor. Our associate pastor is Maria Teresa Jones. Kim Strong is our director of Christian education, and Heather Batchelder is church administrator, which we know that Heather will be leaving in the next couple of months, so Kim is taking on some of her responsibilities. Neil Maxey is our music director, and Margaret Wages is our choir director. Now, of all of those people, only one of them is affected by the UMC appointment system, and that is me. I am your appointed senior pastor. Maria is ordained, but because Maria is ordained in the UCC, the United Church of Christ, Maria is not appointed to Green Street. They're hired as a minister from a different tradition, but we have, as we'll see this a little bit in the FAQs, we have some flexibility when it comes to hiring non-United Methodists. I will also point out, so last year before Kelly left, Kelly was appointed as the senior pastor of Green Street, and I was at the time appointed part-time as associate pastor. So sometimes, depending on what tradition the associate pastor is ordained in, they may be appointed as a UMC clergy person. But when it comes to, Kim's position or Neil or anybody, those are not affected by the appointment system. So a couple of FAQs, and some of this got covered a little bit, but we can go over these. And this is a document that we have that evolves some, but we can certainly share it. So basically, how are decisions made about hiring pastors? So as we said, we have an Episcopal polity. Episcopal means bishop. All Methodist denominations, which includes the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, etc., as well as Episcopalian, Lutheran, and Catholic churches have bishops. In the UMC tradition, the bishops appoint pastors to churches, and the system has changed over time and is now done more on a consultation model through the cabinet, which is the gathering of district superintendents, and the PPRC, the Pastor-Parish Relations Committee. But the authority of the appointment system still lies with the bishop. In contrast to this polity, a congregational polity, Baptist, Presbyterian, UCC, etc., involves members of the church calling, hiring, and firing a pastor. So if you have friends who are Baptist or Presbyterian, they may have processes that involve taking a congregational vote or those kinds of things. We operate more in a consultation representative kind of model than we do a congregational model. And, just my grandfather is a retired United Methodist pastor, and he remembers showing up for annual conference in June and being told that he was moving in 2 weeks. And that was when and how he got the news. There's a lot more taken into account and a lot more time given these days. All right, we went over this already, but how long are UMC pastors' appointments? A United Methodist appointment is for 1 year. Each year, the congregation, the PPRC, and a pastor are asked if they would like to continue with the present appointment, and if a change is requested, this can be forwarded to the bishop for consideration in the appointment process. So y'all may not have known it, but even though Kelly was here for 20 years, he was here 1 year at a time for 20 years, because that is how the appointment system works. And then the normal timeline for appointments. Appointments are made in the spring and are usually announced after Easter. They are officially set in place at annual conference, which takes place in June last year and this year. This year will be online again. And appointments begin on July 1st. Appointments are typically July to June, and an appointment made outside of that would be up for review at the same time as a typical appointment. So, Kelly left at the end of December, which meant that I was appointed January 1st, which is a little odd, but it does happen, and we refer to that as a mid-year appointment. So technically, I was appointed to Green Street from January 1st until June of this year, and I have not heard otherwise and assume I'm going to be reappointed in July. A few more frequently asked questions. Can we choose our senior pastor? So no, a senior pastor would need to be a United Methodist elder under appointment by the bishop. So it can't be just any clergy person that Green Street might want to bring in. We're part of this bigger connectional system. Can we hire a non-UMC clergy person as senior pastor? No, for the reason given above. And we recognize that, our relationship to the denomination might feel a little iffy right now with General Conference going on, but for now, this is the system that we're operating as part of. Can Green Street hire an LGBTQ plus senior pastor? And to be clear, this would be an out LGBTQ plus person. So the answer to this question has gotten more complicated since the second delay of General Conference 2020. Because this pastor would be under appointment and the UMC has not resolved issues regarding the LGBTQ plus community, Bishop Leland will not make an appointment of an out queer clergy person before he retires in fall 2021. And just to note, this does vary by bishop. There are some conferences where a bishop will make such an appointment. We happen to know that we are not one at this moment. The period between Bishop Leland's retirement and when General Conference happens, and that should be changed to 2022, is a bit of a gray area. If Green Street identified an out queer United Methodist pastor they wanted to bring in under appointment, there are ways to transition into this strategically. So the answer to this question is basically it's complicated. Can we choose an LGBTQ plus co-pastor or associate? If we're hiring a non-Methodist for the co-pastor or associate pastor position, like Maria, then the answer would be yes, if it's someone who's outside the Methodist tradition. We probably could technically hire a Methodist for a position other than senior pastor if they were willing to not be under appointment. That can get a little complicated. But regardless of how all of that works out, the senior pastor under appointment has to be United Methodist. We can develop formal relationships between denominations when hiring a non-Methodist, but they're not necessary for Green Street to hire a pastor. Does the bishop have to sign off on all staff hires? No, just the United Methodist pastors appointed to the church. Churches with larger staffs can have more than one pastor appointed, as we briefly did last year with me being appointed part-time. They typically have more say in appointments beyond the senior pastor. And if hiring a United Methodist elder, this would have to be approved by the bishop. And it's a good idea to be upfront in our communication with the bishop and cabinet about who we're hiring and why. For the most part, they want to know who they are responsible to appoint and if their salaries and benefits are covered. And over the last year, we have been in frequent contact with RDS, with the bishop, through the Pprc, through Kelly, and now through myself, and they've been very willing to help us have conversation, recognizing that Green Street is its own kind of place and sometimes requires some particular considerations when it comes to appointments and staff. Does the Pprc hire other non-appointed staff? So sometimes, usually in larger churches, the Pprc is the SPRC, the Staff Parish Relations Committee, and operates more like a personnel committee for all of staff. Other times, the staffing is handled by the senior pastor in consultation with the Pprc. And these days, Green Street's Pprc operates somewhere in the middle, consulting with the senior pastor on clergy and program staff changes, generally approving and giving feedback on job descriptions and hiring decisions regarding positions like building manager, choir director, etc. And the Pprc also we have assigned liaisons to each staff person on the Pprc so that every staff person has kind of an HR connection directly to the Pprc in case there's ever an issue within staff. What is the congregation's role in hiring or firing an appointed pastor? So the Pprc is key in this process. They develop a church profile that is used by cabinet and bishop to match pastor to local churches. They also communicate with the DS on the mission and needs of the congregation. While there is no direct congregational role in this process, as opposed to congregational polity, where a vote may be held on calling a pastor, the Pprc is set up to represent and consider a broad range of perspectives and needs within the congregation as a whole. And what determines how many pastors or staff are hired at a given time? As a congregation grows, so does its need for paid staff. This is assessed by the pastor and the SPRC or Pprc. And operating within the limits of the church budget, because our staff are paid by the church, not by the conference. New hires are done by pastor in consultation with SPRC or by the SPRC or Pprc. And if a Pprc wants to hire a United Methodist elder, they must also consult with the cabinet and bishop. And those are all of the FAQs that we had. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now. I know I ran through that really fast, and if you've not been Methodist long, that might have left you with a whole lot of questions, but that's fine. That's what this time is for. So I'm going to stop talking and open it up to y'all to ask questions. And then if our Pprc folks want to jump in to answer them, that's fine, or I'm happy to help as needed. Oh, Bonnie, you're muted.
What would keep a church from being able to get a pastor? Say they had a pastor who left and they're ready to get a new pastor. And is there any circumstance under which they wouldn't be able to get a new pastor?
That's a good question, Bonnie. It is the cabinet and bishop's responsibility to ensure that senior pastor appointments are filled. And I guess I have sort of known of cases where there might be a delay in that, but not the way you might see in a congregational setting where like there has to be a long period of interviewing and recruiting pastors. Generally speaking, those get filled very quickly if there's ever a change at an odd time of year or something like that. The bishop kind of makes those shuffles to get the puzzle pieces fit together.
And I'm thinking of Jimmy Creech, who I knew before he ran into problems with preaching against gay bashing, and then he got horrible blowback from the denomination. Well, really, in case people don't remember, all he was saying is it's wrong to beat them up. I mean, that's basically what he wasn't even talking about marriage or anything at that point. But when he was then assigned his new assignment, he got assigned to two small churches in Eastern North Carolina. One of them wouldn't even give him the keys to the building, and the other one wouldn't schedule sermons. So are we approaching with the sort of, maybe not a schism, but are we approaching a time where the kind of backlash might affect ministers in those kinds of negative ways? I'm concerned about people. I mean, had Kelly stayed, for instance, and had he made a different decision about marriage or something like that, I could imagine there would have been serious, potentially career-ending, costly repercussions for him. But might there be some others, like suppose the church decided that they would limit, like the Baptists did, the role of women being able to preach and that kind of thing? Because it seems like we're really on the verge of some very severe leanings toward, well, not the Handmaid's Tale, but we're really not headed in a great direction.
Yeah, that is an interesting series of questions. There's a lot there. So a church is not allowed to do those things to their pastor. That is a case where the district superintendent, if there were resistance in some way, the district superintendent would step in to kind of to mediate whatever conflict might be arising. In the case of, let's say I officiated a same-sex marriage and was brought to trial and removed, that is generally not happening right now. There's like sort of an informal moratorium on bringing folks up on charges. Then that would be a case of my appointment ending and they would send someone else in. And I don't know that I hear your concern, and I think you're right that is a thing that the UMC is grappling with broadly. Obviously, at Green Street, there's been quite an effort to bring the whole church along with a lot of this. I think it'd be one thing if a pastor just showed up at a church one day and announced, "I'm going to officiate this wedding," without getting the buy-in. But then, this church has been walking that path for a long, long time, right? So I don't know if that answers that, but.
Well, it's time for other people to ask, but I've been thinking about this a long time.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Wanda.
I'm curious, how many other congregations within our district or even the conference would you say follow the same mission statement as Green Street? And with the change with each bishop, how is it understood that this is what Green Street is? And you get what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I feel badly that I'm answering all the questions, but if anybody else wants to.
Go ahead and answer the number question. I don't know the answer to that, but then I will add a little on just related to your transition.
Yeah, so I don't know in terms of, broadly speaking, we kind of always say, like, whatever demographic exists in the United States, there is a United Methodist Church that represents that demographic, which is beautiful in that we have all kinds of different people that are Methodist. It also makes it really, really hard to address social issues and to make decisions around things that might come up that might be controversial. In our district, I'm trying to remember, I think we have a couple other reconciling either congregations or communities within congregations, but I'm not really sure about that. But yeah, Shelley, if you want to speak to sort of Green Street's reputation at the conference.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thank you for that question, Wanda. It's I think very important. Because it directly relates to kind of our process for naming Sarah as our senior pastor when Kelly was stepping away in kind of mid-appointment. So the superintendent had a really, pretty honest conversation with us where he let us know that he knows who Green Street is, and he knows, that we are very clear on our values and on our expectation that our senior pastor embody those values, and that he was not interested in a situation in which we would be essentially required, because you could see a way in the policy around, because to Bonnie's question, they're not supposed to do that to affirming pastor, but also, there under the policy, there's a scenario in which we would end up with a senior pastor that doesn't align with our vision, right, and our values. And so Chris and I and the rest of PPRC were pretty clear. We rewrote the church profile, which is basically a 2-page document that tells the bishop and other leaders what we value. And we didn't pull any punches in that profile. We were very clear about what we value and what is not acceptable at Green Street because of the community we're trying to build. And so, I think that was an opportunity for us to, within this process, like, respect that we don't get to choose our senior pastor, and set some very clear boundaries around what would be an acceptable senior pastor in our context. And I mean, honestly, I'm not telling y'all something you don't already know. Like, nobody wants Green Street to have a cause. When it comes, especially not at this moment with where the Methodist Church is, right? And so they were, especially Superintendent Moore, were very collaborative with us, and still very clear that it was not, inevitably, it wasn't like the PPRC is naming this person, right? That's what the district does. We were really fortunate in that we had an internal person who was qualified and ordained to be a senior pastor in the United Methodist Church and who aligned with our values. I think I am very deeply grateful to Sarah for her service, and I know many of us are, but particularly because it was a midterm appointment, right? And so it's like, who, there's a lot of question marks that I had around like who else we might be able to bring in at the midterm. And so, yeah, so I hope that is kind of a little bit of helpful clarification. I think I will say from the part of PPRC, our focus has been and remains to be that, like, to protect the community that we have built at Green Street through our conversations about leadership. And so I think that that's a main reason why we wanted to have this conversation, because we were starting to see that, like, we want a lot of feedback. We want feedback as we continue, to talk about the future of Green Street. As Sarah mentioned, it's a year-to-year appointment cycle. And like, we didn't feel like, a lot of people had questions, and it was like, a lot of people were asking questions that said to me, like, I want to be involved and I don't feel like I have the information I need to be involved, if that makes sense. So that's really why we wanted to kind of start this conversation here.
Thanks, Shannon.
I have a concern that I just want to bring up, and that is with the general conference being put off once again, and the impact that has on the LGBTQ plus community is real unsettling to me. I mean, I just hate feeling like we're hanging, in threads practically. And I don't know of anything that we can do, but just thought I would at least acknowledge my concern, and I think it's shared by others that I've talked to, and just see if anybody has any comments about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Lucy. That you're absolutely right. I think we all kind of feel that tension. And just to name, a couple things that are potentially positive. So Maria is ordained in the UCC, which allows same-sex marriage. So
Right.
Maria can officiate any wedding. Maria officiated Lynette and Katrina's. If we wanted to, Maria and I could co-officiate a wedding, and as long as Maria did the certain parts, I wouldn't get in trouble, theoretically. So I think there are ways to be creative and strategic to continue to reach out to that community. Something that I've kind of generally asked a couple of leaders that we haven't really had a chance to have a full conversation about yet is a number of years ago, Green Street made this marriage statement to say, we're not going to have any weddings in our sanctuary until everyone can get married. And I think I've gotten my head wrapped around. The thought was that it wouldn't be too much longer before everybody could get married. And so that can has been kicked down the road so many times that I do think, at some point there's a question of at what point do we revisit that statement or that approach or whatever. But even short of that, I think there are ways that we can continue to be intentional about that outreach and that welcome. But yeah, I share the tension.
Thank you.
Sarah, it might also be worth mentioning that we're planning to have another forum like this one on that very topic, because it is very concerning, and to continue to delay justice and full equality is so troubling for all of us, I think. So we do want to have a forum on that topic to provide some more information about it and help answer questions and give people just an opportunity to hold some space for those feelings.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder, Kate. Yes, we're going to work on that.
Well, I would wonder if there's any organizing or planning going on around when we do reconvene the General Conference. It's so essential to make absolutely certain that every possible eligible delegate that is gay affirming would be there, and that we would maybe network with all the other reconciling congregations to make sure that they have every intention and every understanding of the importance of having all of their full complement of delegates there, and not leave a single vote uncounted. We were at the Churchquake, which was a Reconciling Congregations national convention several years ago, and I've stayed in touch since then with quite a few people from across the country who we just sort of have an email group going, just old-fashioned email, and as opposed to like, social media. And so they're very concerned that when the time finally gets here, that people will find themselves, because of COVID and maybe attendance being down at some of the churches and stuff, and their finances maybe are in a slump, or even membership has diminished and they won't be qualified for as many delegates and that kind of thing. So they're starting to get worried that they'll maybe not be able to have as many delegates there, or not be able to afford to send the ones that they have. And it just seems to me like maybe it's time to start organizing against the possibility that we might have a general conference next year or the year after or something, which is really soon when you think about it with all we've been through.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. And I think that's probably something we can address more in a town hall specifically about General Conference. But just to name, so Lynette Whitaker is one of our delegates to General Conference. And Lynette shared with us that all of the delegates that we have elected to General and Jurisdictional Conference, who we elected like in 2019, they will stay the same. So we actually did great in our conference. We got like all of the progressive and moderate people that we wanted elected. So like we're good to go in our conference. There are a number of other conferences like that. Folks on those teams are definitely worn out, and Lynette named that struggle of feeling like you had all this momentum and then it keeps getting stopped in its tracks. And so I think Lynette may be able to provide us with some suggestions of how to offer encouragement and perseverance to some of those delegates. But and that organizing is all happening. Reconciling Ministries Network is continuing to do a lot of that work, and We'll see what happens when we get there, but I think we'll talk more about that in a session specifically focused on General Conference. So.
And I will speak up for just a second, but one of the persons elected is my Carter, and she's a young clergy from that was elected from Western North Carolina, but she now lives in Kansas City, Kansas, and is still obligated to be our representative as a young clergy person from the Western North Carolina Conference. So there's there's a touch of Green Street even being spread out across the United States. So they're all, from what I know, from what I understand from her perspective, they are still very actively having this conversation and talking about it and making plans for the upcoming conference.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. Yeah, so Carter is ordained in our conference, is appointed currently in Kansas City, but still is a clergy person in Western North Carolina. So if you're ever appointed somewhere outside, you have to have what's called a charge conference, and Green Street is Carter's charge conference. So we continue to be in relationship with Carter, which is pretty cool. But yeah, Carter's on the delegation. Lynette, my dad, is on the delegation. We've got connections to stuff that's going on.
That's reassuring.
We've got people.
It's just not coming soon enough.
Right. Absolutely right.
Well, and just to connect the timeline about general conference to what Pastor Sarah shared in the slide. So, PPRC, we're really focused on having leadership that does three things: that aligns with the values of Green Street, aligns with the needs of the congregation as they change and emerge, and is representative of those values, needs, and the congregation, right? And so we're in a context right now where we're not able to call a queer senior pastor unless they are in the closet. And that is not something that I am comfortable or really frankly willing to ask someone to do. And so I just wanted to kind of make sure that was clear. And that has been very transparent, both on our committee, but also with Sarah, and kind of thinking about her timeline. Like, we are trying to, I think, hold two things or many things really at one time. But really trying to hold the fact that we are a Methodist congregation, right? We do have to follow Methodist guidance and that there are ways to do that right now in a way that's true to who we are, because we have other staff and clergy, right? So just wanted that to kind of be laid out, because I think as we're in ongoing conversations about, the future of Green Street, it's very closely related to whether or not a queer clergy person can serve in the fullness of their humanity, right, through the United Methodist Church. So.
Any other questions, or if anybody on PPRC who knows about such things has anything that hasn't been addressed around appointment and all of that stuff that you think is important to share, feel free to chime in.
I have a question about the appointment process. How common is it, I guess they check in annually with the pastor and the congregation. If a pastor and a congregation are happy with the situation, how common is it that they would not continue that person's presence there? Because the Methodist church that I grew up in, we were kind of similar to Green Street. We had a pastor there for a really long time. I was always aware that this was something that happened, but I never actually saw it in action, but sort of got the message that was unusual, and we were lucky in that we weren't sort of disrupted with the relationship that we had. And so it's just kind of curious moving forward what that might look like.
It definitely varies. That's a good question. And historically there was kind of the stereotype that Methodist pastors moved every 3 years, and that was it, and it didn't matter if you liked them or didn't, and that really was kind of how it worked for a long time. And as the world has changed, as there are fewer clergy spouses who are unpaid associates and more like clergy spouses who have their own lives and jobs and kids and all of that has shifted. And so in general, appointments, as long as it is, copacetic with, I just use the word copacetic with the pastor and the congregation, then folks sometimes stay longer than they once used to. It does happen that church and pastor will ask not to have a move, and it might happen because there is a need somewhere else in the conference. And when one piece moves in this conference, like everything kind of has to shift. So, generally speaking, the cabinet and bishop try to honor the wishes of both clergy and congregation, but it always depends a little bit on these bigger outside forces. But at least my experience is that it's a little more tilted toward the needs of the pastor and congregation than the system itself, at least more so than it used to be.
The other thing I'll say about that, even though I'm not an expert on Methodism, is that I do know a good bit about churches, and our PPRC and our congregation really works to be in alignment with our staff and to be in support of our staff and to have conversations up front if there are issues, as opposed to waiting until that appointment and then putting in a form that we're not happy, which has happened in our district to pastors, right? And so I think that's the other reason why you might see someone, from the outside be like, oh, they were reassigned. And it's that seemed to come out of nowhere. It's not, especially given our conversations with the superintendent, it doesn't seem like that is their preference for how to operate. They seem to be very congregation focused in that decision making and not wanting to move someone. And I mean, again, the fortunate reality is we're like a unicorn, right? We're a very particular kind of church. So they probably don't want the headache of us being unhappy. They also probably don't want the headache of trying to find a pastor that wants to be the senior pastor at Green Street.
Or really for a long time of figuring out where to send Kelly Carpenter. I mean,
right. Where would they have sent Kelly? So yeah.
I was about to say, that one day I would have such a reputation, but I might already be there. I don't know.
We support good trouble.
Indeed.
So I do just have one other thing, and that is, well, first, I'm learning a great deal, and I really appreciate this. But I also just want to ask, is there a particular reason we're doing this now? Is there something coming up, or is there I just have to ask,
That is a fair question, Bonnie. These FAQs were written months and months and months ago, and we just had not figured out the best way to share them. And this is just the first time we figured out a way to have the conversation. So no particular reason for this moment, except that, it is very relevant to conversations around General Conference and all of that. So, yeah.
And I will say there was some confusion in the church around the appointment, around Sarah's appointment and the transition from Kelly, thinking that we essentially were in control of that, and why wasn't there a vote? So there is still some misunderstanding in the church about how appointments work, and I was some wondering about the process. So we're just trying to be really clear and transparent about the system, and would certainly welcome suggestions about how do we make this clear, and we plan to announce Sarah's reappointment when it happens, and to make it clear that this is an appointment, and our role in that.
We also have, in addition to Sarah's appointment, we've had some pretty significant staffing changes at Green Street during the pandemic, and it's just hard to talk through that in the way that we would like to in a congregation, when we're not in person, a lot of the conversations Kate mentioned could have been somebody grab me or grab Chris or another member of PPRC after church and say hey, I'm confused, can you explain it? But when you're in a context where the person has to like call you on the phone and then figure out a time that they can chat with you, like it creates barriers, and we want to try to eliminate as many barriers as possible so that people know that we're not intentionally trying to be obtuse, and that when the process is going on, we're like forbidden from talking about it. So also strategically talking about it right now in the middle of Sarah's appointment, when like no one could accuse us of like trying to do things like politics in ways we're not supposed to, is strategic, because now we have this and people know what the process is, which is not a secret. And it doesn't seem like we have another agenda, right? Like in the midst of an appointment. So that was the other reason. And yeah, just like wanting, I think at Green Street in general, we want people to feel like they're a part of the process. And I mean, for a long time, Kelly just kind of did things and took care of things and like kept us moving. And even on PPRC, we're like, wow, a lot of us didn't know much about this process before we were in it. And we want people to feel like they can ask questions if they have them, right? And so it's like, let's do that now, so that also it's kind of sending a message, hopefully, that like, if you have questions after this, if you have questions in 6 months, like we're here to try and answer them, with the caveat that the slideshow you just saw was a gift that our senior pastor brought us, because she's an ordained elder in the Methodist Church.
Well, yeah, and that's great, Shelley. And the pieces of the process that have to be confidential, it's because of this connectional system. So like, if I knew that my friend at X church was leaving this year, I'm immediately like, oh, where are they going to send that person? And then where's that person going to go? And then who's going to replace? If it starts to get weird for other churches. So it's not just about Green Street. And our situation, this situation was very unusual to have had like a part-time associate who became the senior pastor. That doesn't usually happen. More often than not, those appointment changes affect other congregations. And so that's a big part of what the confidentiality at certain stages is about. Any other questions or comments even?
I just want to thank the PPRC for arranging to do this and making the time to be transparent and to help us understand the system. And it's just so nice. I mean, to see everybody too. This is another way to see people and to interact. And I value that so much these days. So I just want to say a big thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Lisi. Yes, and really, the PPRC has been working really hard, since before I came on full time. So it's, grateful for all their work.
Other Lisa wants to say thank you also. It's been an interesting meeting. I've learned a lot, even after being in Green Street for almost 14 years. Because a lot of things are, sometimes people think that a lot of things is not necessary to be said, but this gave a great groundwork for continuing information between people during this pandemic.
Thank you, Lisa. Glad you're here.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, if y'all think of other questions, you know who to reach out to now. And we will post this recording so that other folks who couldn't come can watch it. And if you're talking to folks at Green Street and they ask some of these questions, you're better equipped to answer some of them now, and you can always send them the link. We'll put this on our YouTube channel so that it's available.
Great.
Everybody go enjoy this beautiful day. I am about to myself.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you for this.